Contents. Preface. Unit 1. The Chemistry of Life. Chapter 1. The Study of Life. Introduction. 1.1. The Science of Biology. 1.2. Themes and Concepts of Biology. Key Terms. Chapter Summary. Visual Connection Questions. Review Questions. Critical Thinking Questions. Chapter 2. The Chemical Foundation of Life. Introduction. 2.1. Atoms, isotopes, ions, and molecules. The building blocks. 2.2. Water. 2.3. Carbon. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 3. Biological macromolecules. Introduction. 3.1. Synthesis of biological macromolecules. 3.2. Carbohydrates. 3.3. Lipids. 3.4. Proteins. 3.5. Nucleic acids. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 2. The Cell. Chapter 4. Cell Structure. Introduction. 4.1. Studying Cells. 4.2. Prokaryotic Cells. 4.3. Eukaryotic Cells. 4.4. The Endomembrane System and Proteins. 4.5. The Cytoskeleton. 4.6. Connections between cells and cellular activities. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 5. Structure and function of plasma membranes. Introduction. 5.1. Components and structure. 5.2. Passive transport. 5.3. Active transport. 5.4. Bulk transport. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 6. Metabolism. Introduction. 6.1. Energy and metabolism. 6.2. Potential, kinetic, free, and activation energy. 6.3. The laws of thermodynamics. 6.4. ATP. Adenosine triphosphate. 6.5. Enzymes. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 7. Cellular respiration. Introduction. 7.1. Energy in living systems. 7.2. Glycolysis. 7.3. Oxidation of pyruvate in the citric acid cycle. 7.4. Oxidative phosphorylation. 7.5. Metabolism without oxygen. 7.6. Connections of carbohydrate, protein, and lipid metabolic pathways. 7.7. Regulation of cellular respiration. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 8. Photosynthesis. Introduction. 8.1. Overview of photosynthesis. 8.2. The light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. 8.3. Using light energy to make organic molecules. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 9. Cell communication. Introduction. 9.1. Signaling molecules and cellular receptors. 9.2. Propagation of the signal. 9.3. Response to the signal. 9.4. Signaling in single-celled organisms. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 10. Cell reproduction. Introduction. 10.1. Cell division. 10.2. The cell cycle. 10.3. Control of the cell cycle. 10.4. Cancer and the cell cycle. 10.5. Prokaryotic cell division. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 3. Genetics. Chapter 11. Meiosis and sexual reproduction. Introduction. 11.1. The process of meiosis. 11.2. Sexual reproduction. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 12. Mendel's experiments and heredity. Introduction. 12.1. Mendel's experiments and the laws of probability. 12.2. Characteristics and traits. 12.3. Laws of inheritance. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 13. Modern understandings of inheritance. Introduction. 13.1. Chromosomal theory and genetic linkage. 13.2. Chromosomal basis of inherited disorders. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 14. DNA structure and function. Introduction. 14.1. Historical basis of modern understanding. 14.2. DNA structure and sequencing. 14.3. Basics of DNA replication. 14.4. DNA replication in prokaryotes. 14.5. DNA replication in eukaryotes. 14.6. DNA repair. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 15. Genes and proteins. Introduction. 15.1. The genetic code. 15.2. Prokaryotic transcription. 15.3. Eukaryotic transcription. 15.4. RNA processing in eukaryotes. 15.5. Ribosomes and protein synthesis. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 16. Gene expression. Introduction. 16.1. Regulation of gene expression. 16.2. Prokaryotic gene regulation. 16.3. Eukaryotic epigenetic gene regulation. 16.4. Eukaryotic transcription gene regulation. 16.5. Eukaryotic post-transcriptional gene regulation. 16.6. Eukaryotic translational and post-translational gene regulation. 16.7. Cancer and gene regulation. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 17. Biotechnology and genomics. Introduction. 17.1. Biotechnology. 17.2. Mapping genomes. 17.3. Whole genome sequencing. 17.4. Applying genomics. 17.5. Genomics and proteomics. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 4. Evolutionary processes. Chapter 18. Evolution and the origin of species. Introduction. 18.1. Understanding evolution. 18.2. Formation of new species. 18.3. Reconnection and speciation rates. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 19. The evolution of populations. Introduction. 19.1. Population evolution. 19.2. Population genetics. 19.3. Adaptive evolution. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 20. Phylogenies and the history of life. Introduction. 20.1. Organizing life on Earth. 20.2. Determining evolutionary relationships. 20.3. Perspectives on the phylogenetic tree. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 5. Biological diversity. Chapter 21. Viruses. Introduction. 21.1. Viral evolution, morphology, and classification. 21.2. Virus infections and hosts. 21.3. Prevention and treatment of viral infections. 21.4. Other acellular entities. Prions and viroids. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 22. Prokaryotes. Bacteria and archaea. Introduction. 22.1. Prokaryotic diversity. 22.2. Structure of prokaryotes. Bacteria and archaea. 22.3. Prokaryotic metabolism. 22.4. Bacterial diseases in humans. 22.5. Beneficial prokaryotes. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 23. Protists. Introduction. 23.1. Eukaryotic origins. 23.2. Characteristics of protists. 23.3. Groups of protists. 23.4. Ecology of protists. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 24. Fungi. Introduction. 24.1. Characteristics of fungi. 24.2. Classifications of fungi. 24.3. Ecology of fungi. 24.4. Fungal parasites and pathogens. 24.5. Importance of fungi in human life. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 25. Seedless plants. Introduction. 25.1. Early plant life. 25.2. Green algae. Precursors of land plants. 25.3. Bryophytes. 25.4. Seedless vascular plants. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 26. Seed plants. Introduction. 26.1. Evolution of seed plants. 26.2. Gymnosperms. 26.3. Angiosperms. 26.4. The role of seed plants. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 27. Introduction to animal diversity. Introduction. 27.1. Features of the animal kingdom. 27.2. Features used to classify animals. 27.3. Animal phylogeny. 27.4. The evolutionary history of the animal kingdom. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 28. Invertebrates. Introduction. 28.1. Phylum Porifera. 28.2. Phylum Cnidaria. 28.3. Superphylum Lophotrochozoa. Flatworms, rotifers, and nemerteans. 28.4. Superphylum Lophotrochozoa. Mollusks and annelids. 28.5. Superphylum Ecdysozoa. Nematodes and tardigrades. 28.6. Superphylum Ecdysozoa. Arthropods. 28.7. Superphylum Deuterostomia. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 29. Vertebrates. Introduction. 29.1. Chordates. 29.2. Fishes. 29.3. Amphibians. 29.4. Reptiles. 29.5. Birds. 29.6. Mammals. 29.7. The evolution of primates. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 6. Plant structure and function. Chapter 30. Plant form and physiology. Introduction. 30.1. The plant body. 30.2. Stems. 30.3. Roots. 30.4. Leaves. 30.5. Transport of water and solutes in plants. 30.6. Plant sensory systems and responses. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 31. Soil and plant nutrition. Introduction. 31.1. Nutritional requirements of plants. 31.2. The soil. 31.3. Nutritional adaptations of plants. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 32. Plant reproduction. Introduction. 32.1. Reproductive development and structure. 32.2. Pollination and fertilization. 32.3. Asexual reproduction. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 7. Animal structure and function. Chapter 33. The animal body. Basic form and function. Introduction. 33.1. Animal form and function. 33.2. Animal primary tissues. 33.3. Homeostasis. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 34. Animal nutrition and the digestive system. Introduction. 34.1. Digestive systems. 34.2. Nutrition and energy production. 34.3. Digestive system processes. 34.4. Digestive system regulation. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 35. The nervous system. Introduction. 35.1. Neurons and glial cells. 35.2. How neurons communicate. 35.3. The central nervous system. 35.4. The peripheral nervous system. 35.5. Nervous system disorders. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 36. Sensory systems. Introduction. 36.1. Sensory processes. 36.2. Somatosensation. 36.3. Taste and smell. 36.4. Hearing and vestibular sensation. 36.5. Vision. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 37. The endocrine system. Introduction. 37.1. Types of hormones. 37.2. How hormones work. 37.3. Regulation of body processes. 37.4. Regulation of hormone production. 37.5. Endocrine glands. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 38. The musculoskeletal system. Introduction. 38.1. Types of skeletal systems. 38.2. Bone. 38.3. Joints and skeletal movement. 38.4. Muscle contraction and locomotion. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 39. The respiratory system. Introduction. 39.1. Systems of gas exchange. 39.2. Gas exchange across respiratory surfaces. 39.3. Breathing. 39.4. Transport of gases in human bodily fluids. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 40. The circulatory system. Introduction. 40.1. Overview of the circulatory system. 40.2. Components of the blood. 40.3. Mammalian heart and blood vessels. 40.4. Blood flow and blood pressure regulation. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 41. Osmotic regulation and excretion. Introduction. 41.1. Osmoregulation and osmotic balance. 41.2. The kidneys and osmoregulatory organs. 41.3. Excretion systems. 41.4. Nitrogenous wastes. 41.5. Hormonal control of osmoregulatory functions. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 42. The Immune System. Introduction. 42.1. Innate Immune Response. 42.2. Adaptive Immune Response. 42.3. Antibodies. 42.4. Disruptions in the immune system. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 43. Animal Reproduction and Development. Introduction. 43.1. Reproduction Methods. 43.2. Fertilization. 43.3. Human Reproductive Anatomy and Gametogenesis. 43.4. Hormonal Control of Human Reproduction. 43.5. Human Pregnancy and Birth. 43.6. Fertilization and Early Embryonic Development. 43.7. Organogenesis and Vertebrate Formation. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Unit 8. Ecology. Chapter 44. Ecology and the Biosphere. Introduction. 44.1. The Scope of Ecology. 44.2. Biogeography. 44.3. Terrestrial Biomes. 44.4. Aquatic Biomes. 44.5. Climate and the Effects of Global Climate Change. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 45. Population and Community Ecology. Introduction. 45.1. Population Demography. 45.2. Life Histories and Natural Selection. 45.3. Environmental Limits to Population Growth. 45.4. Population Dynamics and Regulation. 45.5. Human Population Growth. 45.6. Community Ecology. 45.7. Behavioral Biology. Proximate and Ultimate Causes of Behavior. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 46. Ecosystems. Introduction. 46.1. Ecology of Ecosystems. 46.2. Energy Flow Through Ecosystems. 46.3. Biogeochemical Cycles. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Chapter 47. Conservation Biology and Biodiversity. Introduction. 47.1. The Biodiversity Crisis. 47.2. The Importance of Biodiversity to Human Life. 47.3. Threats to Biodiversity. 47.4. Preserving Biodiversity. Key terms. Chapter summary. Visual connection questions. Review questions. Critical thinking questions. Appendix A. The Periodic Table of Elements. Appendix B. Geological Time. Appendix C. Measurements and the Metric System. Index.